Boker Tov. Today, Staff Yomi is Kiddushin Samach Gimel, Kiddushin 63. It's dedicated for Yeshua, Hatzalah, Refuah, Nechama, and salvation for all of Klal Yisrael. And we pray for those who are in captivity to be released at once, those who are fighting for the IDF to be successful and safe, and those who are wounded to be healed, and those who are sitting Shiva to be comforted. So today's Daf Yomi, we're going to start on Samach Beis Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. The Gemara tells us here, we're starting this on Chodesh Mar Cheshvan, Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan. So the Daf Yomi tells us, Amar Abaye. Abaye tells us that Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov, the Rebbe, and Rebbe Meir, Kul Svirlahu Adam Makne, Davar Shalom Olam, that these Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov, Rebbe, and Rebbe Meir are all of the position that a person can make a business transaction to be makna. He can acquire something that's not yet in existence. And the Gemara tells us, and Abaye said this applies to the position of Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov, and that we already saw. The Gemara says, Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov Hada Amran. We've already said that. That was yesterday's daf. The Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov says that you can give the truma even where it has not grown fully. It hasn't grown a third. You can already consecrate it and take a truma from it. So that's the position that was done yesterday's daf. Ayin Sham on Samach Beis Amud Beis. But now we say on today's daf, we learn it also from Rebbe and also from Rebbe Meir. Where do we learn it from Rebbe? Rebbe Ditanya on the top of Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. And Rebbe teaches us that it says in the Brisa, "Will taskir Eved El Adonav," that you're not. It says in the pasuk, "You now I return a slave to his master." Now, Rashi tells us that this is a warning to the court that that the assumption is that they're not allowed to return the slave, the court, to his master who had enslaved him and then freed him. That's the assumption, that if the master had freed him and now he wants him back, the court does not return him. But Rabbi says that's not what it's referring to. Rabbi says it's referring to something else. Rabbi says it's referring to a person who has acquired a slave with the full intent to free him. That's what it's referring to. That you want to purchase a slave with the intent to free him. And then if you do that, you don't return him to the master. And Rashi says, because if it was referring to a slave who was already in your possession, then you freed him, then he's not called a slave once he's freed. So it must be that it's referring beforehand, that you're purchasing the slave with the intent to free him. That's what we're referring to. And the Gemara says, what's the scenario? Hey, dummy, what's this case? So Amar Nahum Bar Yitzchak, to go in the Kosav way, you wrote to the slave, when I will purchase you, which is something that's not yet in existence in the world. You haven't purchased him yet. You're acquiring yourself from right now. And so we see that Rebbe allows you to do that. So therefore, Rebbe's are the position of the makne davar shelo olam. And what's the next case? Rebbe Meir. How do we know that Rebbe Meir also says this position that a person can acquire something not yet in existence? The Tanya, Omer leisha. If a man says to a woman, Harayat mikudeshesli, that you'll be betrothed to me, after I convert, after you convert, after I'm freed or you're free, after your husband dies or after your sister dies, or after you get chalitza, since these things are not yet in existence, therefore it's not a valid betrothal. Whereas Rabbi Meir says it is a valid betrothal. Mikudesh, so we see from here that Rabbi Meir says even though it's not yet in existence in the world, a person can make a valid transaction about that. A person can be maknad about davar shalom olam. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Asandor says ain't a mikudesh, it's no good, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says mikudesh, it's valid. So the Gemara says, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, even though it says that technically speaking it's valid because we say Adam Makna Davar Shalom, nevertheless we're going to say you can't do it Mishum Eva, because it's going to cause animosity. Can you imagine if he says to a woman, "You're betrothed to me after your sister dies," and now he's married to her other sister now? You really think that's going to cause love in the world? No, it's going to cause enmity. So therefore, we're not going to allow you to make such a betrothal. Or you're going to marry me after your husband dies. That's also very bad. It's a very bad look. So the Gemara says, "V'nachshem nami Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi." Why don't we consider Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi to be one of those Tanaim who says that a person can be makna davar shelo bala olam? Because he's also saying, he's just saying that technically speaking, it's okay, but for other reasons, we're not going to allow it. The Gemara says, yeah, we did list him. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Hainu Rabbi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is in fact Rabbi, as the Gemara told us already in Shabbos and Yevamos, that is Rabbi. So the Gemara says, the Tanya and V'nachshav Nami Rabbi Akiva. Why don't we also consider Rabbi Akiva? He should also be one who says that a person can be Magna Davar Shalobo Olam, because we learned in the Brisa, we had this in the Dharam. Then a person says, or actually we learned this in the Mishnah, that in the Dharam it states, Konem, if a person says right at the very end of the Dharam, we say that if a person says Konem Shani Osel Aficha, that a woman, we know that that her salary goes to her husband. But let's say she says, "I take an oath that you cannot get any benefit from anything, all my salary, anything I do." Ain't tzarich hafer. The husband doesn't need to reject the vow. And the reason why he doesn't need to reject the vow because her property is already mishubatur, so therefore he doesn't need to reject the vow. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, Yafer needs to reject the vow, Shema Tati Fulav Yeser Minaroi. Well, because maybe she's going to produce extra. And so we see from here that even though she hasn't yet produced it, it's something that's not yet in existence. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva is saying, Shema Tadif, maybe she's going to produce extra from what she has already made. And so therefore, we see from here that she's able to betroth something, even though it's not yet in existence in the world. So therefore, that we see that Rabbi Akiva is also that. Why don't we include Rabbi Akiva? So Amarav, so the Gemara says no. We learned about that. Amarav Huna Bredi Rabbi Yeshua. Now that case is referring to where she says, "But Omeres Yikteshu Yadai Lo Seim V'Yadayim Isnu Ba'olam." That case is referring to where she says. She says, my hands should be consecrated to whatever they make, should be consecrated to my husband. And since her hands are already in existence, that is not something that's not yet in existence. And that's why we don't count Rabbi Akiva as one of the Tanaim who says, Adam Machna Davar Shalom Olam. So now up to the Mishnah on 63a. The Mishnah tells us, Omer Leisha, if a man says to a woman, he says, you're betrothed to me on the condition that I'm going to speak on your behalf to the ruler, or on the condition that I'm going to work for you like a day laborer. Let's say he indeed does work for her, speak for her for the ruler, or works for her like a day laborer, we're going to say she's mikudeshes. Otherwise, she's not mikudeshes. So the assumption, there's two ways to read this Mishnah. We could be reading this Mishnah as that this is a conditional clause on the condition that I fulfill this. I'm betrothing you with extra money. Or we could read it that this is the money. I'm betrothing you, and the money I'm giving to you is the money that the value of me speaking to the ruler or working for you as a day laborer. So Rish Lakish tells us that this is a condition, that's how he's betrothing her by giving her money, and he's making it dependent upon this condition. Says Rish Lakish, in addition to doing all these things, he has to also give her a pruta's worth of money. So the Gemara says, so you mean to say he can't betroth her with the money of the value of the fact that he's doing this work? Is that really the case? Didn't we learn in the Bryce that it's harsher? If a man says the betrothed become married to me with the value of the donkey ride I gave you, or I gave you a carriage ride, or bitzvina, or the ship ride, and she's not going to be betrothed. But if he says become betrothed to me with the money, then I'm going to that I will give you a ride on the donkey. Osho shivcha the karon, that I will give you. By the way, in the first case, it's not good because then it was a loan and you can't betroth a woman with a loan. But let's say he says to her with the money that I will give you a ride on the donkey, or that I will give you a ride on the carriage, or bisvina, or the ship mekudeshes. And then she is betrothed. So we see that you can betroth her with the value of a future work. And if you say in that case also, it's where he gave her money in addition to making that claim. It says no, it says specifically with the money, that the value of what I'm doing for you. And furthermore, Tanya, we have another price. It says Shevi mi b'tzavta, she says, sit with me, or v'kadesh, sit with me, basically, so I don't sit by myself, sit with me together, and I'll become betrothed to you. That's her condition. Or she says, chok lefanai, where she says dance or make merry before me, or rakodu fanai, or dance before me. Also kadima says that, or make yourself, basically make like this building for me. Shamanim yeshbo shava pruta. We evaluate whether or not it is worth a pruta, and if so, mikudeshes. Vimlav ena mikudeshes. Otherwise, not betrothed. But anyway, we see from here that that's the value, and he doesn't have to give her a penny. If you want to say, well, in that case, also he's giving her the money. He says we evaluate it. So we see from here that this is a tiyuf to the Reish Lakish, that this is indeed a refutation of Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish says you can only betroth her with the value, with the shava pruta, and with giving her money, and then the rest is a conditional clause. But here in these brisos, they say that no, you can betroth her with the value of the money. So the Gemara explains no. These brisos that we just cited, they are external, meaning they're not reliable. We can't rely upon them. Why? Because these brisos, and this is a dispute we had earlier back in 48b, that whether or not we say when you hire somebody to do the work, they're working for you every second, you start owing them money, or do you only owe them at the end? So these brisos say that you only owe them at these brisos are of the position, these brisos are of the position, and you only get paid at the end. So until then, it's not a loan, and so therefore you're able to be betrothed. But the time of the dawn, but the author of our Mishnah is at the position that every second that you're working for her is a loan that she has to pay you back, and so therefore she should be able to be betrothed to you from. Therefore, the only way she can be betrothed to you is if you give her money in addition to this clause, and so therefore it's a conditional clause. So the Gemara asks the question: why is Reish Lakish pigeonholing himself into reading this Mishnah as saying that the Tana is of the position that she owes him money right away for that, and so therefore he has to give her other money? Why doesn't she just say, why don't we just say that it was the opposite, that this Tana is of the position that she only owes him money at the end of the work, and there's no payment of pruta. It's that itself is the value. So Amarava Masnisin Kashisa. No, Reish Lakish was bothered by a difficulty in our Mishnah. Why does it say specifically on the condition? Nisni Bischar. Why does it say on the condition? It could have said with the value of. So from the fact that the Tana adds in the words on the condition, now that every time it says the conditional clause, it means that he also gave her money in addition to the conditional clause. And so that's the way to read our Mishnah. So now we're up to the bottom Mishnah on 63a at the bottom. Let's say he says, let's say he says on the condition that father agrees to me marrying you, I'm giving you the money to betroth you on the condition father agrees. The father agrees she's betrothed, otherwise she's not. Let's say the father dies. That's the second case. If the father dies and the father didn't object, then she is betrothed. But let's say the son dies. If the son dies, then we're going to say we teach the father to say that he doesn't want it, because once the son dies, she actually can't be betrothed to the son, but she would fall to Yibum. So we have to teach the father to reject that marriage so she doesn't fall to Yibum. But the Gemara now asks a fundamental question about this case. What does it mean when it says, in addition that father approves? It could mean two things. If you mean it's possible, it means that the father has to say, yes, I approve. Well, it can't be, because what's the middle clause? The middle clause says once the father dies, and he didn't say I object, he's betrothed. She's betrothed. There he didn't say I approve. So it must be Ella. It must be on the condition that father is quiet and doesn't object. And then as long as father dies before he objects, she's married to him. But it can't be that because Ema Seifa, what's the next clause? Mesa Ben, that when the son dies, so we have to teach the father to object. Amai v'hashasik. Why do we have to teach him to object? If he's just quiet, then it doesn't take effect. So therefore, Ella Amarla Manas Shelo Yimcha, Ella Amarla Manas Shelo Yimcha Abba. It must be, he says, on the condition that father doesn't object. So does that mean Reisha B'chad Taima? The first clause is on the condition that father is quiet, and the Seifa in the next clause and the middle clause and the latter clause are on the condition that the father doesn't object. You mean to say that there's two different understandings of the father's action? Does that make sense? And it says Rabbi Yana, yeah, that's all you have to go through. Rabbi Yana, that's the way we have to read our Mishnah. And indeed, Reish Lakish says, Shema Mino with Rabbi Yana. We learned from Rabbi Yana's approach to our Mishnah that methodological principle that that we'd rather say that our Mishnah follows two different ukimtas, two different scenarios. And the first scenario is on the condition the father is quiet. And the second scenario on the condition that the father doesn't object, but it's one person who says it, and we'd rather say this than Treitanai ubechad taima. We'd rather say it's two different scenarios and one Tana than two different Tanaim and one scenario. We'd rather not have an argument. Rav Yosef Bar Ami gives a different approach. He says, it's really one scenario. And what's he saying? He has a very clever solution. He says, what does it mean on the condition that father doesn't object? It means on the condition that my father doesn't object within the next 30 days. So now he's placed a specific amount of time. I'll read the Rashi. And so therefore, he said the father has, on the condition that my father doesn't object to this marriage within the next 30 days. So therefore, if the father agrees when the 30 days pass and he doesn't object, she's going to be betrothed. If he doesn't agree, if he objects within the 30 days, she's not betrothed. And if the father does within those 30 days, she's going to be betrothed because we say, now who's going to object anymore? And so therefore, if the son dies within those 30 days, we teach the father to object, because if it goes 30 days and he doesn't object, then she's going to be a marriage. And this is a very elegant solution of Rabbi Yosef Bar Ami. The only problem is that our Mishnah doesn't give a specific time, and he's the one who invents this specific time. Okay, so now we go to this next Mishnah. We've already had reference to this Mishnah in our Gemara, but we have this case again. A person says, Kidashi, a guy, father, says, I betrothed my daughter, but I just don't know to whom I betrothed her. And then a man comes along and says, Ani Kidashtia, I'm the one who betrothed her. Naaman, we believe him to say he's betrothed her. Meaning to say the father was in the town, he went to the marketplace, and he met a guy and he betrothed her, but he forgot who he was. And this guy comes along and says, I'm the one who betrothed her. Meaning to say, I can marry her. I married her, so we believe him. We'll see what that means. Let's say both of them say, two men come along and say, I betrothed her. Both of them have to give the divorce, and then she can marry a third party. Because she can't marry either of them, because they both claim, I'm married to her. But if they agree, one can give the divorce, and the other one can marry her. So now comes along the Gemara. The Gemara says, when we say that if one person comes along and says, I'm the one who betrothed her, Amarab, Neman Litan Get, they Neman Lichnos. Yeah, when we say we believe her, we say we believe him. We don't believe him to allow him to marry her. No, that we're not going to do. But we believe him to give her the get and say now she can marry anybody else. Why? Them only tongue get, we believe him to give her the divorce, and now she can marry anybody else, because we say that he's for sure not lying about. Ein adam chotev lo. A person doesn't sin unless he gets some benefit from it. But we don't believe him that he's the one who's married to her. Because maybe he just desires to be with her, so he's creating. It's to his advantage to lie and say he's married to her, but it's his disadvantage to say he's the one who's married her, and now I want to divorce her. So therefore, that's how we believe him. But this is what I said on the 1 minute daf, we see from here this principle: a person doesn't sin without getting any personal benefit. We see from here that the basic principle of sin is selfishness. You get something out of it, whereas a mitzvah is the opposite. Sin represents selfishness, and mitzvah represents generosity. So Ravasi says no. Af ne'eman lichnos. A person is also believed to say that I was the one who married her, and therefore I'm allowed to marry her. What's Rav Asi's logic? Because as Rashi says, lo chatzif lemeimar of av, he would never be so chatzif, so chutzpahdik, so obnoxious and arrogant to say to the father that I'm the one who got the Kiddushin, because he knows, he's afraid that maybe the father will say, no, I know it wasn't you. I don't know who I did it to, but I know it wasn't you. So therefore, I'll be afraid. So therefore, he's only going to say it if it's the truth. So that's what Ravasi says, that Af Ne'eman knows. Moda Ravasi, but Ravasi himself would admit to Homeris, where she says, Niskadashti, ve'eni odel mi niskadashti. If she says, I'm betrothed, but I don't know to whom I betrothed. And another guy comes along and says, I'm the one who married you. Then we're not going to believe him. Why? Why? So because there, Rashi says that the reason is because, but he's not so believed that he's not going to be afraid to lie in front of her, as we'll see. We'll see in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Ratu echad nosin gef echad kones. If they want, one could give a get, and one could be the one to marry her. So we see from here that since one can be the get and one can marry her, so this is a proof for Ravasi and a question on Rav. So the Gemara says, do you have to the Rav? So the Gemara says, no, Rav would say, I'm a Rav, Shani awesome. Because what was Rav's whole logic? He says that the reason why we don't believe her is because Shema Yitzra Tokfo. But in this case, Rav says we do believe because Kivan the Ika Achar Bade, since there's somebody else who's also making the claim opposite him, or Suse Mirsas, he's not going to be so bold as to make the claim she married me. And so therefore, in that case, we're going to believe it. Tanya Kavasi to Ravasi. We have a bright that says like Ravasi. Ravasi allows him to marry her because he says if he makes the claim in front of the father, he wouldn't have made it unless it's true because the father, you'll be afraid. So what's the price like Ravasi? Kidash Yasbiti. A man says, I betrothed my daughter. But I don't know to whom. And the guy comes along and says, I'm the one. He can even marry her, just like Ravasi said. Let's say he marries her and somebody else says, I'm the one who did it. We'll call him love. We're not going to believe him, the second guy, to prohibit the first guy upon him. We're not going to say he has enough evidence to overturn it. Let's say the woman says, I betrothed her. And I just don't know to whom I betrothed her. So the woman says, Aisha Shamar, I betrothed, but I don't know to whom. And somebody else comes along and says, I'm the one who did it. We're not going to believe him to be able to marry her under those circumstances because she could be covering over for him. And this is the reason why if she says, I did it, and he comes along and says it, they could be like covering up. They could be in cahoots, so we're not going to believe it. And now the Gemara says, so let's say, would we be able to give stoning on this basis? What's this statement? Rashi says, Al Yado Shala'av, on the basis of what the father says. Meaning to say, if the father says, I betrothed my daughter, and there were witnesses, but they're not coming in front of us, and then she comes along and she commits adultery, so he doesn't know who it is, but there were witnesses, but they are not here, and then she does nus. Can we rely upon him and therefore stone her? So do we believe him when he says he betrothed her? Rav says ain silk. When Rav says we don't give her the stoning, Rav he says silk. When Rav says we do. Rav Amar ain silk. When Rav says now that Rav says we don't stone him, ki amina rachmana la'av. When we do believe in the Torah, this Torah makes a claim and says, I gave my daughter to this man, and now he's saying that he's making these false allegations, and so we believe in that case we believe the father that he betrothed his daughter. When do we believe him? Surah, only to prohibit her to another man, but with katla, but to put her to death. Lo, we're not going lo hamnei. That the Torah didn't give that type of authority. Rav Asi says, Soklin. Rav Asi says we stone her if the father claims he had married her. The Torah believes the father for everything. Amar Rav Asi umodina, but I myself will admit, Bomeris nikdashti, that if she's the one who says I was married, she ain't Soklin, then we're not going to stone her. And Rashi explains that Rashi says that the Gemara is going to explain the reasoning of Rav Asi. So Amar Rav Asi, Hani Shnaita Didi, and this teaching of mine, Mirav Sim Igre, is like breaking roofs, meaning to say it's very hard to explain it, and it's very hard to explain the logic of it. Hashtan, because at first glance it seems like it's counterintuitive. Hashtu ma b'makom Shembalach knows Kones in a circumstance where Rav Asi says that if he wants to come along and marry her and says, I'm the one who was betrothed to her, we say indeed that it's a valid betrothal. But still, Amris Soklim, and in that case we say that we're going to stone her. Makom Shembalach knows Ein Kones is in a case where he says to her, she says I was married, I don't know to whom, and he says it was to me. We don't believe them. For sure, we should say that we're going to stone her under those circumstances because we should say that she was married to somebody else. The Gemara says Vulohi. That's not the case. The father, we believe that he was married, and so therefore that she married, and therefore we stone her. But with Idei Lohemna, but to her we're not going to believe, and so therefore we're not going to give her the stoning. And so therefore, with Ladine Nefashis, Rashi says we're not going to kill her because we're concerned that maybe she wasn't married. But with respect to Isura, what's the reason why we're going to say that we don't allow her to marry him? Because we're saying that she said, I was married. And so therefore, we're going to make her like what's called Shadwa Nafshi Chatiko Dasura. She herself said she was prohibited. And so therefore, that's the reason. Once she says she's prohibited with respect to Isura, we're not going to allow her to marry anybody. But when it comes to killing, we're not going to believe her to allow her to be stoned to death under those circumstances. So back to the Gemara. Rav Chisda Amar Echad Zeh ve'Echad Zeh Ein Sokon. Whether the father is the one who makes the claim or whether she's the one who makes the claim, we're not going to put her to death under those circumstances if she commits adultery afterwards. But also Rav Chisda with Taimed Amar Rav Chisda follows his logic. Rav Chisda says, B'ni zeh ben teisha shana v'yom echad. If a man says, my son is 9 years old, which is the punishment for where we're going to say that that's considered a valid bia to make him liable for the arayus. And if a person has relations with him, that person will be put to death. And also a girl of 3 years old. And so under those circumstances, the father says, my son is 9, or he says, my daughter is 3. We're going to say that under those circumstances, if a person was with them accidentally, the father is believed to bring them to bring a carbon, but not for intentional punishment to give them lashes or death. And indeed, Tanya Kavasi to Rav Chisda, Benize ben Yugimel Shana v'Yom Echad, Biti Zu Bas Yubei Shana v'Yom Echad, Nemel and Dar Mocharamim Lachdosh Saracham V'Lolo Makos Olonchin. We're going to say that we believe them for certain categories to vows and that their vows are not valid, that their hekdesh is not valid, but not to give them the actual punishment. To actually give them the punishment of lashes or death. Okay, I want to just say one thing. Let me stop. Okay, first